Hey guys, time for another Bearded Wonder Explains. This time we're talking about republicanism, libertarianism, and democracy. And just kind of to give you a little bit of background or context, this is what I'm working kind of, or at least related to this, is my dissertation that I'm working on for my PhD. So if you feel like you're getting a little bit more information than you were looking for, sorry, not sorry. First thing that we want to point out is that we are not talking about the political parties here. In other words, when we talk about democracy, when we talk about republicanism, when we talk about libertarianism, while they're going to have a lot in common with our modern American political parties, we are not saying the same thing. It would be anachronistic. That means that we're talking about history as though they know how history turned out. So, even though Thomas Jefferson definitely was maybe Republican, Democrat, and Libertarian in some ways, he wasn't thinking about George W. Bush, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, or Joseph Biden when he made those decisions. And in a lot of ways, if you brought all the founders into our world, they would be pretty confused by how we got here, because there's like 200 years of development that have happened and things change slowly, not quickly. The next thing that we need to kind of understand is, for the purposes of this presentation, when we're talking about kind of checks and balances, we are going to treat the national government as one entity. In other words, the Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court all kind of make up the national government and kind of fight among themselves as well. And so the founders were kind of counting on that being a limit to the expansion of the government's power. But we're not going to talk about those today. We'll talk about those more when we get to the actual branches of government. However, there is the Constitution, and the Constitution is sort of like this rule box. In other words, it puts the whole government into a box and says, here is where you can play, and here is where you can't play. In other words, the Constitution kind of created this boundary for the government, and everything that was inside of that boundary the government could do, and hypothetically at least everything outside of that boundary the government could not do. And there were certain people who wanted to add to that, and so they added a Bill of Rights, which basically even more clearly defined, here are absolutely the things that are outside of the boundary, especially when it comes to how the national government is going to treat the people. In other words, it put certain rights for the people completely outside of the boundary and made it very clear that these are outside of the boundary. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion, abridging the freedom of speech, those kind of things. It basically said, listen, the government cannot make any laws about certain things, and here are what those things are. Also important to kind of keep in mind that the Bill of Rights in the Constitution did not apply to the states. In other words, if you were a citizen of, say, a state like Pennsylvania or South Carolina or something else like that, you had your own deal with the state. And so the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is really the people's deal with the national government, and some would argue not even necessarily the people, but the states deal with the national government, and then the people have a deal with the states who have a deal with the national government. But that Bill of Rights was meant to put certain things outside of the national government standpoint or purview of power. So there's this very complicated thing, and we'll talk more when we talk about federalism in a future video, about the people's relationship with the states and the states' relationship with the national government. But for today, we're going to focus on those checks and balances. In other words, what's going to keep the government inside of the box or inside of the boundaries, and how does that work? And that's where we're going to talk about republicanism, democracy, and libertarianism, or it might be more accurately termed classic liberalism. So, the first thing that we need to understand is that the people are not just one group of people, right? There are different people within society, and those people had different interests and ideas about government. And so, if you break the people out into two groups, kind of the wealthy or the aristocracy, and then the common people, the aristocracy kind of felt like they were the ones that were the most qualified to run the government. Now, they had a couple of good reasons for this. The first is that if you're a farmer, you don't have a whole lot of time to learn about different governments, to think about or read, say, Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and all of these kind of political thinkers from antiquity, from history. You just don't have time for that. And so there was this idea that the aristocrats, because of all the time they had, because of their higher education and everything else like that, that they knew what was best for running the government, that they knew how to build a financial policy, that the common people wouldn't understand what it meant to create a bank or to borrow money or not borrow money. They wouldn't understand how that works. And so in some ways, those people were almost paternalistic towards the common people. They would treat them that way. And basically the idea was, we'll let the common people vote for us, and then we'll go into the government and we'll make the laws that are best for us. That's kind of republicanism, that certain people are more qualified than other people to know what is best for them. And like I said, there are some legitimate arguments for that. Most of us, even today, don't really understand financial policy and how it would actually impact our economy. And so there is something to this argument that there are experts, and maybe it's better if experts kind of run the government. However, there is also this idea that the people kind of know what they want. And there's a lot more of them than there are of aristocrats. And so nobody wanted to be kind of told what they had to do by the aristocrats. And so there's this issue, what we would call democracy as well, where everybody kind of gets a vote. One person gets to vote, and we just count up the votes, and that's what we do. The problem with that is that there was a real concern that the minority, in other words, if you're not in the majority when they vote, how do we protect the minority from the majority? Right? How do we stop them from voting for the government to just have the power to take things away? Specifically talking about money, right? Bill Gates has a lot more money than I do, but there's a lot more teachers than there are leaders of Fortune 500 tech companies. And so if you give one person a vote and every teacher votes to take a lot of Bill Gates's money through taxes and then give it to ourselves, that's not going to be fair to Bill Gates. It's basically going to give the government the money, and then maybe I'll give myself another stimulus check, right? And I'll basically use the government to steal his stuff because I can outvote him. And that's not really fair either. And so they were trying to balance these two ideas, but there was an even third concern, which is, okay, no matter who's running the government, right? What's going to stop the government from trying to make the boundaries bigger? In other words, what's going to stop the government from gaining more power than we tried to give it? So we have this Constitution and this Bill of Rights, but the problem is that if the Supreme Court is the one that decides, where's the Supreme Court? Well, it's right there. So if the Supreme Court is what says what the Constitution means, then what stops the government from changing what the government said the government can do, right? Which is going to cause it to become more powerful. And so one of the ways that they stop that, besides counting on the government fighting with itself, right? So first off, we've got to get all three branches of government to agree to expand the government's power. But even when they do that, we have things like jury trials. Things where, if you go to trial with a jury Who are the jury? Well, they're not the government, right? They're just 12 people that you picked from the community. And so when those people look at the law, if they decide that the government's out of line, then the jury can kind of overrule the government. At least that was the idea, and kind of force it back into the box. And there was another layer to this, and that's what we're going to talk about next time. But there's still these states as well that could hypothetically shove the government back into its box. This is kind of what the nullification crisis and other things are. They're very concerned about this circle staying where they put it, the founders are. But they also don't want any one group of these people. So we have the states, we have the government, we have the people, we have the aristocracy, we have the common people. And the reality is that we don't want any one of these groups to have so much power that they kind of take over the whole system and force everybody else to do what they want. And so when we talk about checks and balances, normally in government, what you'll hear people talk about is within those three branches of the national government. In other words, inside of that red circle, you'll learn about checks and balances where they fight against each other. But the founders were concerned about a lot more than that. A lot of times you'll hear this referred to as the separation of powers. And really what they wanted to do was give each of these kind of groups of people power over each other in a way that became so complicated that really only the things that happened were what had to happen. In other words, the only rules that we're actually going to make here are going to be rules that we need to have, rules that make it so that the government's able to deal with real problems instead of becoming the problem. And so that's kind of all of these kind of issues, these republicanism, democracy, and libertarianism. There is a very real sense in which when you look at the arguments of the political parties, and remember we said that they're not exactly the same thing, but when we look at what the libertarians and the Republicans and the Democrats are all saying about the government, the reality is that they are all right, but they are also all wrong, right? Because what the founders really did, what the idea was, at least for creating our government, and by the way, nothing obligates us to do what people 250 years ago started in our country, but what they started was kind of all three. So the Republicans are arguing a part of what has been American for the last 250 years. And so are the Democrats, and so are the libertarians. So it's not kind of like, well, some of them are more American than others. It's really they're all kind of American, and they're all advocating for maybe one of these groups or a couple of these groups. But the founders were really trying to get all of these groups to have different power that would limit it so that only the important stuff happened. It's a lot of information, but that's kind of a bigger picture of what our government was designed to be. We'll talk next time about federalism and specifically the relationship between the people, the states, and the national government, and how that kind of played out over time. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a good day.